With the long absence of man's influence since their departure from Terra, this covert society of Orion-influenced Human, secretly directed by the Seeker, had been given practically free rein and successfully implanted itself into the highest levels of not only the region, but in some cases even further. Though they were small in numbers, their influence began to shape the outcomes of societal direction in many areas and in some fairly disturbing ways. Realizing that a returned Seeker Armada, having been directly forewarned to them, could spell certain annihilation for the now Human population covering Terra, their purpose was quite simple, direct, and determined. It is believed that based on the original Orion sect methodology, that even within this obscure sect, only a very few were even aware of the ultimate message which directed their efforts. And a truly malevolent effort it was. This process began a vast public subtle misconception. There but for the greater good go I. This had obviously become a twofold philosophy. The simple and outward truthful nature of this principle became a foundational social maxim, even with subtle modifications to the language through time, though covertly within this Orion sect meant something entirely different and entirely sinister. It had become, in essence, a two-faced lie. The existing Orion city-state had over this time evolved somewhat on its own, and the Human had attempted their own construction of similar Orion facilities, though were crude and nowhere near as sophisticated. There had been a developed writing system implemented by the Orion Human culture here, but more for reasons of tracking their wealth and power than to necessarily record historical processes. By and large, though, the dark essence of the Orion culture remained intact well through this period. To this end, even the natural ores originally directed to be mined for their masters became the basis of the planetary economy. These materials are to this date still counted as the basis of this now oppressive global economy and are overseen by this sect. By this time, the Norman to the far north had successfully organized a fair population under them and, with their direction, had implemented some simple advancement to enable these tribes to not only prosper, but to soon maintain dominance in the region. There had been some intermittent extraction and replacement of Norman teams throughout this long period, and this activity remained unknown to either Orion or the Seeker. Luckily, the successes experienced by these carefully guided Human tribes also did not draw any immediate focused attention either. This very slight and advantageous circumstance was what maintained the only contact between Terra and the rest of off-world tribes, as there was no more surveillance of this system due to the presence of the Orion moon base. But as the growing Terran tribes were gaining sizable populations everywhere, it soon became obvious what was going on in the rest of the world regarding both the Seeker and Orion influences and where this appeared to be heading. The most disturbing part of these observations was only now becoming readily obvious. If the Seeker could manage to take utter control of Terra, complete these plans by further treacherous corruptions globally, they could utilize a massive population of Human under their control, and ultimately no race in the galaxy would be safe. The tribes of man would in essence be in danger of being overrun by their very own descendants if these Human were properly managed by the Seeker. The hideous irony of this situation was by far the most sinister and unthinkable plan ever conceived by Draconis to date. They would not need an army of reptile hybrids when they could simply use man's own as their weapon for ultimate domination over man and the rest of the galaxy. An easily replenished army of controllable subjects, with the added irony of them being from the tribe of man. Certain varying degrees of communication between the multitudes of tribes at this point heightened into another focused discussion on ways to expedite an obvious and necessary response. These discussions led to many courses of action, only some of which have become known or even remotely understood by nature of their outcomes, and it is unsure if details of the final solution have become manifested yet or not. The most recent team of Norman, still hiding in secret and located to the far northern hemisphere, were ordered to begin seeking out isolated human tribes in an attempt to head off any further Orion influences. A few of these team members entered the next immediate continent and found an already growing and somewhat organized human population, though the early beginnings of Orion infiltration was starting to creep through this region. They continued for a time, and they managed to locate and contact some human tribes who so far had not succumbed to such infiltration, though these were small and isolated instances. What successes they managed here either fell to the wayside in the long term, or who technically went so far underground that to date it is only suspected who or where they are. There are remains of some potential human influences by way of unusual structures, though to date these may be simply local human copies in reverence to their teachings. Their last and most disturbing discovery was the obvious Orion structure located on this continent in a very isolated and remote fiefdom close to where they would have most likely come ashore in their immediate travels. The remainder of the team directed members of their northern charges to travel to a continent so far left untouched to the west to pass this information and knowledge on. There were indeed scattered tribes of human developed there without interference so far as is known. In the short term, there were some successes of contact with human tribes which up until now had not been touched by the Orion. But they heard recounted tales of Seeker contact in the remote past. They also discovered that in the remote past, a few of these human had been approached by both the doll and some other unknown and undetermined race as well. Since there was no occurrence of these particular events or when or how they actually happened, this information did not become of importance until this point in the story. At this time, though, due to the lengthy travels here which involved their very arduous task, the Norman charges ultimately never made it back home and disappeared into history. Though it is suspected where they made their last contact and the final territory of their eventual demise, this too has not been confirmed as yet, as the documented evidence has been removed. At this same time, the Norman retrieved their ship from below the surface where it had lain dormant for quite some time and headed directly to the faraway human settlements to the southwest. The descendant human tribe of the original human settlement were developing into such a state of Seeker corruption and depravity that it was decided from a suspected off-world source to utterly remove them from Terra in order to save them and transport them to a safe colony world of man. This way, they could be reintroduced to the tribe of their original human beginnings and Talman lineage, and it was considered the only human success in the entirety of the Sol campaigns. The whole of these human were evacuated by the Norman, and their disappearance went surprisingly unnoticed for quite some time. It is unknown which system or tribal colony they were taken, though this event has been passed on. It can only be vaguely assumed that this reuniting with the tribes brought a renewed and focused interest to the current plight of Terran Uman. Though this was not to be the last intervention of man on Terra, it would be the last overt act of this period, and would henceforth shape the direction and course of theirs and others' futures. There are a significant number of tales which occurred since the close of the last period covered here involving the tribes of man, their allies, and their ongoing difficulties with the obvious other characters. Some of these events have been briefly recorded, but by and large many of them continue veiled in the realms of Terran mystery, myth, and quietly whispered rumors in the dark, lonely nights. Some of them well known, some of them not so much, and even more which continue to be obfuscated simply because of their inherent and potentially disruptive nature. This last course can only at this moment be reluctantly accepted due to the nature of the pervasive control and ambiguity of the Orion culture still quite securely in place on this world. But as for the remainder of the directly involved parties, there remain certain positions and stances which continue to shape the continuation of this story far beyond its humble and simple end here. The Orion Alliance and Seekar, though still quite entrenched on, around, and within Terra and its moon, have reached a sort of tipping point in both their actual versus perceived control of both the Sol system and its many current inhabitants, both within and outside the system. This point is believed to be what has restricted Draconis from following up on their threat to send an armada into Sol, though there is no doubt, if pushed hard enough, they very well could. The sheer volume of races operating vast fleets both inside the system as well as patrolling the outer rim of Sol in multiple locations has brought any potential and overt confrontation with the Seekar here to a complete and utter standstill. To date, it has not been reported whether or not a Draconian vessel has even been seen here. Even though a few reports have popped up from time to time, they have received marginal attention and appear to have not been entirely accurate. It is only now understood that maybe for the first time in their seemingly eternal history, the Seekar Draconian Empire feels a modicum of fear. A word that up until now did not even exist in their own prehistoric language. Though they well understood the concept, it is only now that this concept has relevant meaning to them. As is understood, the Empire to date has not moved on Lyra ever since the near offensive during the time of the early Sol campaign. This can be attributed to both the losses they received during this campaign as well as the subsequent constriction of empiric activities at the same time. Their perceptions of man seem to have evolved from a view of them as mere fodder to ultimately a vast force to be more carefully observed and warily reckoned with. The changes philosophically in this stance may also be the first change in the unwavering draconian mentality ever perceived. Though their focus eventually turned from Lyra to predominantly Sol, they always seem to carefully maintain a respectable edginess towards the Lyran systems. Though now, from a restricted and sensible gulf of wariness between the two, it is because of this change in Seekar stance that man has ultimately garnered somewhat of an upper hand. But this current favorable position of the tribes of man has evidently not yet led to the willingness to wage what would literally become a galaxy-wide war. the ramifications to the entire community would destabilize not only both these two races immediately, but would spill over to other races and systems far and wide in an uncontrollable and assured carnage of massive proportions, leaving no civilized system untouched. The colonies, homeworlds, and systems of man are now so scattered throughout the galaxy that had man been as like-minded as the Seeker, then technically the tribes of man could control the largest chunk of the galaxy and therefore be a larger empire than Draconis operates now. This point too is undoubtedly not lost on the Seeker either. It is most attributable then to man's philosophy and foundations that has practically isolated the Seeker to within their own borders and without such massive confrontation, and has inherently brought the entire community to bear on them without, as far as is known, any severe repercussions. Though it has been reported very briefly that there was somewhat of a severe standoff at the Sol system edge many years ago, though the participants and the outcome has not been publicly divulged. There are the remaining issues concerning the Tau, the Doll, and their allies within the surrounding Orion Alliance. Though they are still hard-pressing to reach their own final solutions, they too have become somewhat handicapped by the restrictions of some embargoes and further system blockades throughout many systems they operate in. It has recently been learned that the Doll activities in Procyon with the Norman tribe has failed, and Algamisa has for the most part been successfully retaken and returned to the fold of man, and in essence driving the Doll out and away. The Doll continuation of Seeker and Tau projects are still quite active, and yet is believed that they are in the very same position of witnessing the writing on the wall, so to speak. Their activities appear to be more of a direction of their own and less Seeker conducted, as they too have been witnesses to the further constriction of the Draconian Empire, for which many of their alliance have also been waiting and hoping for in their own odd ways and reasons. Whether or not any ultimate separation of the Tau and Orion Alliance from the Draconian Empiric control happens is still pending, though some minor analysis points to the final Orion failure in Sol with the Andromedans as the beginning of the end. The defining nail-in-the-coffin event has yet to transpire. It should be noted here and now that there are other players in this broad picture who are neither related to the tribes of man or any of the other races mentioned to this point, though their specific racial archetype and locations have in some cases been either vaguely referred to or have an actively reported track record, have for one reason or another not been directly involved or responsible for the events covered in this history. Some have come with the most honorable of intentions, and others without so much as a sense of mercy. They too have been shadowing the activities in Sol simply out of focused curiosity to the activity here, and in some ways interfering in their own unique and as yet unrealized manners and agendas. The fact alone should prompt all to maintain careful observation, determination, and diligence. It is believed at this time that the Seeker still continue maintenance of their empire and subsequent interference in many systems, and their hopes that this current state of an obvious alliance of several opposing races occurring in this remote and little system would destabilize any attempts by man to successfully end their position here. But as in all things, this too is still unresolved and does not appear to be close to any practical end stage. As the last, an obvious enigma then presents itself. One is forced to ponder both its direction and its unrealized meaning as well. All the combined races of the galaxy are still quite fascinated by the Human, by Terra, what is occurring here and why, but especially what these Human have within their unusual lineage. They hold a secret which has been kept from them for the untold thousands of millennia. It is this secret which has remained obscurely nameless until now. It is understood that Human contain genetic knowledge, wisdom, and power that supersedes all the other races, and in some cases, even the old tribes of man. The Human have brought a curious set of emotions back into this universe. A universe that has, due to the vast course of time, become devoid of such emotions which throughout billions of years worth of difficult and changing evolution has reduced each of their brief time of sensitivity to a long-gone ember whose light went out eons of epochs ago. It is inherent of the Human species. It is inherent because of the Human past. It is inherent of the Human destiny and who they are. Because of the ancient Human lineage, because man originally came to this place from a forgotten elsewhere so long ago that they have brought with them and within themselves the culmination of an untold power which the other races are to this day still seeking to merely touch in some manner. Human are actually so very old. They are so very much older than even they are aware of, and they are unique because of it. And maybe more so, the Human can be more than even they assume they could be. Human can then fulfill being man from the fire. If the corruptive influence could be finally broken, then Human society could relinquish their false masters and realize the true nature of what lies ahead